On Saturday, May 21st, 1791, the weekly edition of the Bengal Journal reached Colonel de Canaple in the French settlement of Chandarnagar in Bengal. A few minutes later, he rose from his chair, shaking with rage. The Bengal Journal now crumpled in his hands. You see, the journal that day had carried an article titled "Generosity Rewarded," in which a grave rumour was printed. Charles Cornwallis, who was the Governor General of Bengal at the time, had died after a brief illness in Bangalore. The article had sourced the rumour to distinguished persons amongst the renegade French. There was no one more distinguished than Colonel Canaple amongst the French in this part of India. The Bengal Journal had indirectly alleged that the rumour about Cornwallis's death had come from Colonel Canaple. This was an outrage. He had said no such thing, and everyone knew that Charles Cornwallis was on a military campaign against Tipu Sultan, the ruler of the Kingdom of Mysore in southern India. Colonel Canaple vowed to ensure that whoever was behind this article would pay for libeling him. He would sue him. Who was the editor of this ridiculous rag? It came to him. It was that upstart Irishman, William Duane. 2 days later, on Monday, the 23rd of May, 1791, Colonel Canaple sent a letter to Edward Hay, the secretary to the British government in Bengal, and complained of the libel against him in William Duane's Bengal Journal. Later that day, Duane was summoned to the council house at Calcutta. After getting his ear chewed by Edward Hay, Duane agreed to apologize and print a retraction to the offending article. The next day, Duane arrived at Colonel Canaple's house. The grumpy French colonel kept him waiting. This irked Duane. When he finally got his audience, which included a number of Colonel Canaple's friends, the meeting did not go as expected. While Colonel Canaple was expecting an apology, William Duane instead launched into a speech about the rights of the press and of man. Colonel Canaple didn't get his apology. He got a political speech about all types of freedom from a guy who sympathized with the French Revolution. He was even more incensed. You see, Colonel Canaple was a French royalist. France had undergone an historic and bloody revolution that began in 1789. The tentacles of the French Revolution had also spread to the French settlement of Chandarnagar, now called Chandarnagar, in Bengal. By 1790, Chandarnagar's French population was split between people who sympathized with the French Revolution and those who supported the French monarchy. In fact, things got so bad that Chandarnagar's French royalists sought shelter in Calcutta, which was under British rule. They had to escape from local French revolutionaries who were hunting them across Calcutta. Governor General Cornwallis also extended his support to the royalists, but only in exchange for a promise from the French that they would stay neutral in his campaign against Tipu Sultan. Colonel Canaple, as a royalist, had narrowly escaped being executed by his own people. Outraged by Duane's speech, Canaple shot off another angry letter to the secretary to the British government in Calcutta. He wanted William Duane disciplined. The British, not wanting to annoy the French and their shaky peace, said they would deport him. This is Reality Scribes. I am Vasundhara and Sumit.
And I am Sumit Chaturvedi. We are Indian journalists who in this podcast are telling you the story of the origins of Indian journalism and taking you through the history of Indian society's news and information ecosystems, our news culture, and how these have evolved over years, decades, and centuries. Okay, so here we are again. A newspaper journalist and editor is again facing deportation or some sort of legal action for printing things that annoyed the East India Company. So let us set the stage for you. There are a few things about the context in which people like William Bolts, James Augustus Hickey, and William Duane operated in India in the late 1700s that we need to know about. First, this period was marked by numerous wars between rival powers. The British and the French had already fought over Chandarnagar. The East India Company had fought the Mughals and other Indian rulers, including Tipu Sultan and the Marathas, who were amongst the company's most formidable adversaries. In case you are interested in this period and want an even more in-depth assessment of how British consolidation of India occurred, we strongly urge you to read John Wilson's India Conquered, among other works. We mention these conflicts here because in the late 1700s, the British were not keen on militarily engaging with the French presence anywhere in India unless they absolutely had to. They already knew that the French supported Tipu Sultan. They wanted concessions to ensure that the French did not deepen their support for their traditional local adversaries. This also explains why the company officials were happy enough to chuck William Duane under the bus on a complaint from the French, and freedom of the press be damned. The second thing worth noting is that not only were all newspapers in India British owned at the time, but the ones that survived did so because they actively courted the patronage of the East India Company. In short, every aspiring publisher, editor, and pressman in the late 1700s had learned from the fate of James Augustus Hickey and his Bengal Gazette. To survive, they needed to be on good terms with the company. Third, many publishing houses also served as printers for the East India Company. They published notices and ads for free and expected their papers to freely use the postal system for circulation. Fourth, the press catered to a British and European audience, so we see newspapers cropping up in the presidencies, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Finally, Indians were a residual category in the columns. These papers were not for an Indian audience. Also, as many newspapers survived due to the company's patronage, they weren't always keen to report on what was being done to Indians. Oppression isn't pretty, and those who were doing the oppressing, that is the East India Company and its people, couldn't have exactly come across as good human beings in such a case. A few short years after Hickey's Bengal Gazette started in 1780, there were multiple papers in circulation in Calcutta. As we have already mentioned, Messink and Reed had started the India Gazette in November 1780 as Hickey's direct company-backed competitors. The Calcutta Gazette began circulation in 1784, and the Bengal Journal and the Oriental Magazine were started in 1785. The Calcutta Chronicle was started in 1786, and in 1793, Hugh Boyd started the short-lived Harkaru. Meanwhile, in Madras, the Madras Courier was founded in 1785, and the Weekly Madras Gazette and the India Herald were published a decade later. In 1789, the Bombay Herald appeared in Bombay, and a year later, the Bombay Courier made its presence felt. In 1791, the Bombay Gazette was started. So now that we have the big picture or the backdrop that framed the actions of people like William Duane, let's get back to him.
William Duane was born on May 12, 1760, to Anastasia Sarsfield Duane and John Duane, an Irish immigrant couple that had recently moved to Newfoundland, which was a British colony at the time. From Newfoundland, the family moved to America, and when Duane entered his early teenage years, the family moved back to Ireland, to Clonmel to be precise, where his mother's wealthier relatives lived. Duane spent his teenage years in Ireland with his landed Catholic middle-class family. His mother thought priesthood was a good career choice for young Duane, and indeed, Duane did talk about his religious education, as noted by American President John Quincy Adams in his memoirs, with whom Duane came to be closely associated later on in life. Everything changed for Duane in 1779, when at the age of 19, he married an Anglican girl. He had always shown a streak of behavior in which he clashed with authority figures, but his mother saw this rebellion as against their Catholic middle-class interests. She cut him out of her will. This forced a young Duane to seek employment in Clonmel at a newspaper called the Hibernian Advertiser as an apprentice printer. The man who owned this newspaper was one Edward Collins, who was a Protestant and also a Freemason. For those who may not be familiar with the term, the Freemasons are a society that were originally born as a sort of brotherhood from guilds of builders in the Middle Ages in Europe. Over time, they developed chapters in various parts of the world, and today they exist as a sort of social or philanthropic organization. Duane had broken free of his family and his path to Catholic priesthood and married someone who was deemed unfit for him. Thrashing around for a place to land, he found refuge in Edward Collins's worldview and his shadow. In later years, the influence of Collins would be seen in Duane's life choices. Collins was also a supporter of the Irish volunteer movement, which was an assemblage of militia formed locally in Ireland with local initiative, ostensibly to maintain law and order across Ireland, while the regular British forces were away fighting in the American colonies. Duane was very impressed with the Irish volunteer movement. You see, the volunteer movement focused on uniforms, symbolism, and had a military appeal which had a wide influence on young lads like Duane, who grew up in that era. Throughout his life, Duane flirted with military careers and would jump into any sort of a military uniform at the drop of a hat. But it is also from here that his idea of what it meant to be a citizen was born. The volunteers carried weapons, they were patriotic, they combined diverging forms of Irish nationalism with patriotism and martiality, and this led to their idea of what it meant to be a citizen. For someone like Duane, who was born in Newfoundland, moved to America, moved back to Ireland, had close contact with empire in India, and realized he didn't really belong fully anywhere, it would become important to find a place to call his country. Later on in life, William Duane would want to create his own form of citizenship for himself. This question of belongingness would haunt him for his whole life. In 1782, Duane left Clonmel with his family for London. This was in keeping with a pattern. In the mid to late 18th century, many printers, especially Irish ones, became journeyman printers. Now, these journeyman printers emerged in Europe after the invention of the printing press. These were men trained in the latest printing techniques of the time, who also formed a class of migrant labor. They helped spread printing to many parts of the world. After they had trained with a master printer, young men would take their skills and knowledge and go to other countries or kingdoms, working as pressmen, typesetters, and proofreaders. National boundaries never stopped them, and they were crucial in the spread of a new culture of information exchange between cities and the countryside that did not solely rest on scribal skills. Many such journeyman printers moved to America, and some moved to India when changes in industry due to the early Industrial Revolution meant that artisanal guilds began evolving and became more involved in politics. Opportunities to become masters of their trade as printers were low.
We only have a smattering of information about Duane's time in London. We know that he had an uncle who was a solicitor and offered him a pathway into law, but Duane couldn't stand it. He then began focusing less on the mechanical side of printing and slowly moved to writing. According to his son, cited in Nigel Little's book Transoceanic Radical, Duane even worked as a parliamentary reporter, making him one of the earliest journalists to report on parliamentary proceedings. He is also credited with having reported on the impeachment of Warren Hastings. At this time, this was pretty radical. After all, people outside the parliament got to know what was going on inside the corridors of power. In 1786, Duane was approached by Philip Young, who was the proprietor of the India Gazette. Young wanted Duane to go to India and become the editor of his paper in Calcutta. Duane pounced on the offer. By December of that year, he had sent his wife and kids back to Clonmel from London and had secured passage aboard an East Indiaman, a type of ship that operated under the charter of the East India Company. The ship was called the Rodney. On 30th January 1787, the Rodney set sail for India. On board were an assortment of recruits and officers, along with a cargo of iron and copper. Duane had enlisted as a recruit. Nigel Little, his biographer, suggests that this was possibly because Duane wanted free passage to India. It was also an indication that he had perhaps hit rock bottom in London. Either way, we are confident that William Duane had absolutely no intention of serving in the East India Company's army. Many journeyman tradespersons at this time would enlist to get free passage, and on arrival at their colonial destination, would have the Governor General discharge them from service, leaving them free to carry on their trade. During the 18th century, there was a slew of journeyman printers who joined the company from Great Britain and Ireland. Nigel Little points out in his work that the East India Company's own embarkation lists prove this. But why were they journeying to India? There are several reasons that are often cited by historians. First, it was hard to be a printer in London because their profession was almost transitory. Duane later pointed out that the crackdown on trade guilds' collective political action in London, combined with an economic downturn, led tradespersons, especially printers, to embrace seditious politics. The political class had often underestimated the power of trade guilds and their capacity to organize and solve problems through collective action. Under pressure from the state, many emigrated and plied their trade across Europe. Some went to America, others came to India. It is worth reminding ourselves that India represented a giant piggy bank for Europeans down on their luck. The unintended consequence of this was a boom in newspaper printing in the presidencies in India and the airing of grievances against the East India Company, which ultimately led to stringent censorship of the colonial press. Coming back to Duane, his voyage was an interesting social learning class for him. As a private recruit, he would have to bunk with other recruits who often came from humble and rough backgrounds. Being middle class himself with an ambition to hobnob with the rich and powerful people of society, Duane found himself seeking out the officers on board the ship. 5 months later, in June 1787, the Rodney finally docked at Calcutta. On arriving here, Duane found that the job he had been promised as editor of the India Gazette was no longer available. Too much time had passed between when the offer was made and his arrival. So Duane got himself discharged from the company army, and before long he was working as a writer in the company's revenue department. He also joined the Freemasons in Calcutta. He networked and built connections with important people including William Hickey, who, if you remember from our episode 3, had defended James Augustus Hickey in one of his early trials. Among other people, he also connected with the secretary to the company government in Calcutta, Edward Hay. In 1789, Duane entered into an agreement with James Duncan and Stephen Casson to manage their paper, the Bengal Journal. This deal had been made possible with the intervention of William Hickey. By 1790, Duane was a co-proprietor of the Bengal Journal, owning a third of the share. This was a recognition for the work Duane had put in to make the journal a success. He had in fact boosted circulation of the paper in 3 months from 130 to 300 subscribers. William Duane now lived 700 meters from the Hooghly River on Bao Bazaar at the paper's printing office. In less than 3 years, he had moved up in the world of Calcutta.
Yet, William Duane found himself dwelling on the margins of British society in Calcutta. Think of him as an overlooked guest at grand balls, standing next to potted plants in the corner. He became acutely aware of how his Irish heritage meant that many English persons looked down on him. His suspicion was confirmed when William Hickey, who also belonged to the Freemasons' Lodge No. 2, left the lodge because he thought it was too plebeian. For William Hickey, the Freemasons were a gentleman's club, not a club full of artisans and trade persons like Duane. For Duane, the Freemasons were a brotherhood that was inclusive. Despite this treatment, Duane persevered and poured all his efforts into making the Bengal Journal a success. Over time, Duane and the Bengal Journal gave stiff competition to the rival newspapers that had sprung up since 1780 and the beginning of Hickey's Bengal Gazette. Then in 1791 came the Canapler affair, where Duane insisted that the press was free and expected the East India Company's higher-ups in India to side with him. He was disappointed. In many ways, as Nigel Little explains, this confirms a streak of naivety in Duane. He lived in the middle of an oppressive colonial regime and still believed that Enlightenment values of liberty and the British Constitution meant something. Nigel Little writes, Duane often projected his enthusiasms onto those around him and was then surprised to find that they disagreed with him. It is important to note that for Duane, these British principles were a part of who he had become, an Irish immigrant raised in America and Ireland who had chosen to immerse himself in the politics of England and embrace the identity of being an Englishman. Things changed for him after the Canapler affair. He faced deportation because he could not apologize to Colonel Canapler and further humble himself. The British in this case were pursuing a case against William Duane not to censor the press, which they would have liked, but because they wanted to keep things on an even keel with the French presence in Bengal. What further complicated the matter for Duane was that he technically did not have residency in Britain and was only in Calcutta because the East India Company had allowed him to be. He also could not prove American citizenship because the East India Company had recorded his place of birth as Newfoundland, which was a British colony at the time, which also meant that he was a British subject. Being of Irish heritage didn't help him either. He was in a weak legal position to challenge the authority of the Governor General. It turned out that Colonel Canapler knew this and sidestepped the courts to appeal directly to the Governor General.
By June 1791, Governor General Cornwallis had returned from battle and was proved very much alive. He ordered that Duane be arrested. Soon after, on June 3rd, Duane was imprisoned in Fort William. His residence was ransacked. On June 7th, Duane pleaded in a letter to the Governor General that he be allowed out of prison so he could save some of his property and shore up his finances. By the 12th of June, he was back in the fort. His attorney suggested that his arrest was unlawful and filed a habeas corpus petition. The court turned it down, so his attorney filed a second petition. This time it was accepted, but only to be overruled by Cornwallis on June 16, 1791. Duane was going to be deported, but they had released him on bail to settle his affairs. Then the unexpected happened. Canapler died. His successor, Fumeron, was more sympathetic to the French Revolution. By November 1791, Fumeron had written to Cornwallis for leniency in the Duane case, and dropped all charges against him. But Duane was ruined. Everything he owned had been stolen, and he had lost his share of the Bengal Journal. He had bad credit, and it was hard to find someone who would loan him money given that he had invited the ignominy of the East India Company. 6 months later, in early 1792, William Duane bounced back with a bang. This time he had launched his own newspaper titled The Indian World. It is unclear how he got funds for this venture, but it is suggested that he perhaps had borrowed money from an Indian banker. Everything about his new newspaper screamed William Duane. It was a conscious world of thought which was not monopolized by the elite of Calcutta, but included, through letters, the voices of the rank and file of the East India Company Army, the British ne'er-do-wells. Duane's voice and philosophy, now in the avatar of the world, stood outside the company, outside the church, and outside the strictures of nobility and class. He had created a republic of letters. Of course, he was going to get into trouble with the East India Company. He had, after all, created a space where people could anonymously write letters and openly discuss the company and, more importantly, its army. But there was another thing. If you recall, in the first episode of our podcast, we told you about how the British had learned the importance of information and had begun to co-opt information gatherers that had operated under the Mughals. By the 1790s, the company was deeply involved in campaigns against various Indian rulers, and one key factor remained extremely important to the East India Company Army. They knew that information flows must be monopolized along with trade. Free opinions, airing of grievances publicly, too much discussion of officers and higher-ups, and the East India Company could potentially have a mutiny on their hands. They could not afford this. After all, many of the men, including officers in the East India Company Army, were mercenaries hired on pay. Then there was a structural issue. There were men who were in service to the King of England and those who were specifically in service to the company and paid by them. Military careers were built on social class. The East India Company soldiers came from humble backgrounds, while the officer cadre tended to reflect elite society. You did not need to be from the upper crust of English society to get into the rank and file of the East India Company Army. However, given that many such soldiers were often prone to bouts of anti-monarchism, there were instances recorded where soldiers mutinied, famously in 1764, for instance. Dr. Callie Wilkinson, historian and a friend of this podcast, whom you have already listened to in our earlier episodes, further elaborated on the dynamics of the British Army in India at the time.
What I think is quite interesting about this period is that you have several different armies that are all active in India at the same time. So as you mentioned, you have the British Army. So from the mid-18th century, you have crown forces that are stationed in India. And these will kind of move in and out on a rotating basis. Then you also have the East India Company's armies, and there are actually three. So for each one of the presidencies, there's the Bengal Army, the Madras Army, the Bombay Army, and each have their own kind of commander-in-chief, and each will have their own sort of distinct rules, and each will have very different experiences of service in India. So I think what's interesting is that you have a number of different rivalries, because on the one hand, as you mentioned, there's a very serious rivalry between the Crown forces and the East India Company armies. They both resent each other. So on the one hand, British Army forces are superior in rank to East India Company forces for a long time. So for example, if you have a captain in the British Army and then a captain in the East India Company Army, the captain in the British Army is superior, and there's other things as well. Like, for example, the British Army officers are eligible for certain honors and titles that the East India Company Army aren't. in terms of prestige, the British Army is considered more prestigious at home, so there's all these different advantages. But then on the other hand, East India Company officers, because they're living in India essentially permanently, they're learning languages and acquiring skills that make them more eligible for staff positions, which carry with them a lot of perquisites. So in some ways, there are other opportunities outside the army that East India Company armies are eligible for that can be very lucrative. So British Army officers are looking at that, and there's a lot of competition for these different offices. So both of them basically are complaining that the other is in favor and that the other has an advantage. And so there is a lot of competition, and you see that playing out in the press where each are complaining about the other. But there's also rivalries within the East India Company between the armies of the different presidencies. And a lot of this, again, has to do with perquisites. So the Bengal army are almost always getting what's called bada, which is sort of this special campaign pay. It's this extra money that they get when they're living outside of the capital, basically, like when they're on campaign in the countryside. And they, for different reasons, get a lot more of this than the other armies, and so that's always a subject of complaint. There's a sort of stereotype of the Bengal army officer as like making a lot more money and thinking he's so much better than everyone else. So, there are a lot of different rivalries playing out, and in different contexts, different rivalries will become more important than others. And I think in some ways that's why not that many historians have paid attention to what soldiers are writing in the newspapers, because from our perspective, a lot of it seems very petty, because a lot of it is about who is getting the most honors, who's getting the promotions, who's getting the different offices. And so because of that, we tend to overlook a lot of the more serious complaints and grievances that they're making, because of course a lot of what they're writing has to do with their own self-interest and their own professional advancement. In terms of who are writing letters to the newspapers, it can be hard to know for sure because a lot of letters are written anonymously, especially once it becomes clear that the East India Company is going to be prosecuting letter writers. People are very careful to write anonymously and not to give any hint of who they are. That being said, it seems like both officers from both the British Army and the company's forces are writing. And it's interesting because, for example, like in a few cases, we do know who the anonymous letter writers are because of the sort of disciplinary procedures that were then pursued afterwards. And sometimes letter writers that people assumed were company officers because they were criticizing the company actually ended up being British Army officers. So it can actually be very hard to tell. We think of them as separate, but actually they're serving alongside each other. They're fighting in a lot of the same wars and having a lot of the same experiences. And so even though there are rivalries, they have a lot in common as well.
The worry that the higher-ups in the Bengal chapter of the East India Company had was that this sort of mutinous and disloyal behavior could spread to other sepoy regiments or native Indian regiments. This also had to be avoided at all costs. This is what we have to keep in mind as we delve into what Duane did next. His newspaper, The World, was his own little free space, and he used it to platform many officers from the East India Company who had grievances against the way the army worked.
But platforming grievances against the government came at a cost for William Duane and his Republic of Letters. But what exactly was this Republic of Letters called the Indian world, and what happened to it? That's next time on Reality Scribes. We would like to thank Dr. Callie Wilkinson for her invaluable insights and time that helped us craft this episode. You will also hear from her in our future episodes. Reality Scribes has been conceptualized, scripted, narrated and produced by Sumit Chaturvedi and me, Vasundhara and Sumit. All source material used in this episode can be found in the show notes. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own and do not always reflect the opinions of Reality Scribes or the podcast hosts. You can listen to Reality Scribes on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and do subscribe to our channel. Also, click the bell icon for notifications for when we drop a new episode. You can follow us on social media at Reality Scribes on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. You can also email us your questions and comments at realityscribes@gmail.com for a chance to be featured on our podcast. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, friends.